Yeah, that worked.
We're not crashing and burning yet. All
Yeah.
right. All right. I'm going to let you take it away.
All
Thanks,
right,
Marcel.
cool. So let me share my screen. There we go. And
Yep, looks
start
good.
the slides. All right. So my talk is called Refactoring to Simplicity. I'm Marcel Pociot, and I'm CTO for a company called Beyond Code. You might have heard from us. We are around in the Laravel community for a couple of years now. We create video courses for developers such as PHP package development and the recently released desktop apps with Laracon course. We do a lot of open source such as Expose, which is like an ngrok alternative written in pure PHP. You should check it out. And we also create software tools for developers such as ThinkOL, Halo, and soon Invoker version 2. So follow me on Twitter if you want to just stay in touch. So what actually is simple? What does simple mean if we talk about simplicity? This is the very first code snippet that you see on the PHP Unit website if you want to inform yourself about what is PHP Unit, how does it work. And if we take a look at the code, I think it is fairly easy and simple to understand. So we have a test case, we have this stack test, we have a function which is called test push and pop. We have an empty array and assert that the count is 0. When we push something onto the stack, then we make the assertion that the count is 1. And if we pop something off, we assert that it's 0 again. Pretty easy to follow along. But if I take a look at a real world example of unit tests, I don't know how it is about you, but my tests usually don't look like that. So this is a test taken from Laravel Spark. This is from Laravel Spark 3. I think the code is now 4 years old. All those tests from Spark 3 are available in a public GitHub repository, so you should check them out. I think it's a really nice place to just figure out how Spark is being tested. But if we take a look at this code, just from the initial look at it, it looks a lot more complicated than what we have here with the PHP Unit example code. But then if we would go through it line by line, I think it's still very expressive and simple. But in reality, things are not as simple as we see them on, well, documentation sites, for example. But those has a couple of good reasons. So when we teach something, we start simple. So if I write a blog post, for example, about Laravel form requests, then I want to only focus on the form request part of it. I don't need to start about how you can install Composer, how you install Laravel. This is all not relevant, and I don't want you to focus on this when I teach about this subject. The same thing the other way around. If I am a reader and I read a blog post, I don't need the unnecessary information, or if I consume like a video course. And we also keep things simple, maybe just because of the medium that we use. So in other talks today or at other conferences, the code snippets that you saw were maybe kept simple just for the sake of fitting on a single slide. So if you see a code snippet in a book, then maybe you just have more room to fill and then make the code more complex, just, well, however it fits on the specific medium. So we see all this simple code, but then reality kicks in and we have to see that real life projects are not simple. Usually they aren't. And this leads us to the fact that sometimes we as developers love complexity. And then we have people say things like, I'm not a beginner. I can write my own framework. I'm not going to use something off the shelf. This certainly could have been me. And funny enough, I hear this most often from developers that are starting in their development career. I mean, of course, we wouldn't be here today if Taylor Otwell wouldn't have thought the same thing. But usually this is just adding complexity for a solution that is already out there. And I did it also myself. I would never do it again. I surely learned some things along the way, but well, I would not do it again, as I said. You also have these kind of developers. Usually these are the senior software developers. And then you have a guy come into the office and say, hey, look at these like 1,000 lines of code that I wrote, only I can understand it. So if you ever touch that class, you know who to call. And yeah, I mean, I'm just going to call him Gary. So for every Gary that is watching the stream now, I'm sorry. But Gary is now at the company and he wrote this complex mess of code. And whenever we need to touch either a specific class or a project, we know, oh shit, I need to touch that. I'm going to talk about this with Gary. He knows best about this. And so these people become invaluable just for adding complexity to a specific solution. Now, this is an image of a cathedral in Cologne in Germany. And if you take a look at it, I think it's safe to say that this building looks very complex. It doesn't look like a simple building. There are a lot of these simple ornaments in there, and well, just architecting it and building it, I'm sure was a very complicated task. So with development, we see this. We see the complexity in our real life projects in our own code bases. And then there's a project like Laravel coming along, which just embraces the exact opposite. The documentation says it's expressive and elegant. If you see the code, it's just very simple. And then you have people ask questions like, is Laravel a good fit for a big project, almost like Facebook? First of all, the question is kind of nonsense, but you get then answers from developers that say, no, Laravel or any third-party framework is not a good fit for a big project. Big projects are always long-term projects. Making big software is not an easy task. And the last sentence is like the most important one here. Making big software is not an easy task. So for developers, there's always this little thing in our minds that says something like, if it's hard to write, it should be hard to read. That's certainly what this Gary guy thought when he wrote this 1,000 line of code piece. So this is what simple code means to me. Simple code is expressive. You read it like an English sentence and you can easily understand what's going on. So it's readable and understandable. Because of this, it becomes self-explanatory. And then your code is reassuring. You do not need to have to worry about, if I call this method, maybe there are some side effects. I'm not sure. I haven't written that, and there are like these nested things. I don't know. I don't want to really call this. If you have simple code, it's reassuring. And well, it becomes fun. I don't know how you felt about this, but when I started working with Laravel, I was just constantly smiling for the first couple of weeks. I still smile when I do Laravel code, but the feeling when I started with Laravel is just undescribable. So I still remember that I wanted to add soft deletes to a user model. And all I did was just basically try out, okay, well, there are traits. Let's just try use has soft delete or soft deletes. And it just worked. And it was just mind-blowing to me because it was just so simple yet expressive. All right, so is simple code better? Yeah, thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Well, I mean, first of all, is simple code better than what? So we can't really ask these questions, but let's ask some more concrete questions like, is simple code faster to write? And I have to disappoint you there. Simple code is definitely not faster to write. I think it's more the opposite, that it's actually a lot slower to write simple code and to come up with it. This is another image of a church. Now, given I know the first one was a cathedral in Germany, and this is a church, this one is in Iceland. And if you compare this with the cathedral that we have in Germany, not all look like this, but the one that I showed you, then I think it's safe to say that this looks way more complicated than this. Yet, I believe that achieving this and building this with the rounded curves, the rounded hole in the middle, and making everything seem just so seamless and smooth was not an easy or simple task. Now, let me show you what this means in code. So if we go back to Tinkerwell, or well, not back, if we go to Tinkerwell. For those of you that don't know Tinkerwell, it's basically an application that lets me run PHP code and evaluate it. So we have an array of names, and our task is to print the uppercase version of every first character of those names and then echo them comma separated. Easy, right? So we're going to do a for each loop of the names. So for each names as name, we are just going to echo the UC first of the name followed by a comma. Done. So I go to my boss, show this to him and said, okay, just took me 1 minute, easy. And he goes, okay, that's cool, Marcel, but can we get rid of this comma? And I'm a developer, nothing easier than that. So we're just going to replace this for each with a for loop, because that's what developers do, right? So for I equal to 1, I smaller than the count of the names, and then we're going to increment I. We are going to echo names with the index of I. Everything's still super simple. And then we make a check if I is not equal to the count of the names, then we are going to echo our comma. We run it. It's still not working. Of course, we have to do this -1 thing just because that's how arrays work in PHP. And we achieved it. So these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines of code. And to some people, I think this is simple code. But let me show you what else we could do with this code. So I'm just going to echo an empty line just so I can easily show this next to each other. So what we're going to do is we collect the names, we map them with the UC first version of the name, and then we join them with a comma. And we need to echo that. So if we run this, we get the exact same output. But to me, this is a lot simpler. Now, not only this is just 3 lines of code instead of 6. So yeah, we saved like half the size of our code. This is good and nice. But what's more important to me is that this code does not explain at all what we are doing. It just explains how we do something. We have a loop, we have some if conditions, and then something happens. Well, the lower example here with the collection, we actually say what we do. We collect all our names, then we map them with the UC first, and then we join them with a comma. That's a major difference. But this means that you don't have to mistake familiar code with simple code. So maybe for you, the for loop, the for loop was a bit far-fetched. Okay, I'll give you that. But maybe the loop was more familiar to you than the collections. But that does not necessarily mean that familiar code is equal to simple code. Just because you are unfamiliar with the declarative style of programming doesn't make it less simple. So is simple code better to test? I would say usually yes. Again, it's hard to answer, but if you take a look at this class, for example, it's taken from Laravel Nova. We have a metric controller that extends a base controller. We have a function index that receives a metric request. And then we return all the available metrics for this specific request. And if you write code from the get-go to be simple and you encapsulate everything nicely, I think it becomes a lot easier to test just because you have smaller chunks that you can test. All right, so simple is good and all, but what's in for me? Like, you tell me that it's actually slower to write simple code, so why should I do it? Simple code is more readable. As I said, you can just read it like it is. This makes it unsurprising and more maintainable. If you go back to this for loop in a week, I'm sure you all know what's going on. If you go back to this for loop in like a month, maybe you have to do some digging to actually figure out what you were doing. And if you take a look back at this for loop like in a year, I'm sure you have no clue whatsoever why you did this. And I have to get back to it, expressive code is just more fun. And also, like, the maintenance, it's not only maintenance for yourself, for your future self, but also for your colleagues or the people that you work with, for example, in open source projects. So how can I write simple code? This is like the first thing that I think you need to know. You have to understand what simple code looks like. And this is nothing that I can just show you. I can't just say this is simple code, this one isn't, because you have to figure it out yourself. Read other people's code. Read code on GitHub, read code from other people on your team, and then do code reviews with others. Just because you came up with this one collection method that only Adam Wethen and you know, and it maybe simplifies this one task by removing 2 lines of code, but nobody else on your team knows about it and understand what's going on, maybe this is not actually simpler for your team. So do code reviews, do talk about the things that you want to simplify, and then figure out if it actually makes things simpler for you or not. And refactor your code as it grows. So if you start working on your next class or even method, it doesn't actually need to be a big project. Try to start writing simple code from the get-go, and then I'm sure all your projects will evolve over time. You will add dependencies from other clients, or if it's a side project from your own, you will just add dependencies yourself. So you have to pay attention that every time you touch some code, you try to refactor it, because if you start making code simple, soon it will just branch off and become this ugly 1,000 line of code mess that nobody else wants to maintain. So here are some simple rules for simpler codes. And I know these are easy things, but still, I think it's very valuable that we talk about these all over again. This is a piece of code that I wrote myself like 5 to 6 years ago. I was working on a project that did something like a Pokemon Go API. So that's a bit where this code is coming from. So first line, we have a list variable where we get the map spots ordered by name. So I stored in a variable called list. I would probably just call it map spots, because that's actually telling me what's in there, map spots. And we loop over this. So we have this for each list as key and then row. Again, I would do something like for each map spot as key map spot. And by looking at this now, I am very sure that this line of code was just pre-generated by the IDE that I was using at the time, and I didn't bother to change it. Now, this line is very, very interesting. So we have a variable called max, and in this variable, we get like the max spot site, where map spot ID is equal to the row ID. So this probably could have been a relation. And then we get the maximum date time. As I said, I wrote this like 5 to 6 years ago, and I have no clue whatsoever is going on here, because date time, so this is not even a variable, it's a column name, but date time is a column type. I don't know what's in date time. This should have been, I don't know, seen at or something like that. I don't know. And then we stored in a variable called max, which is also just as telling as the column name. Use useful method names. Again, that's a simple one, but if you take a look at your methods and you have something like update data and you pass something into it, and then you figure out this method actually, for example, it creates an invoice in the database, it generates a PDF, and it sends the PDF via mail, maybe these should be 3 different methods instead, and you should split them up and give each a unique name that you can then identify easier. Use early returns, another simple one, but still. So here we have a method called do something with 2 parameters. And when we run the method, we check if the first parameter is equal to 1, then we go 1 indentation deeper, check if the other parameter is also 1. And if that's true, we do the actual work. So instead of having this nested thing going on, I would prefer to write it like this. So if some parameter is not equal to 1, we just bail out. If some other parameter then is not equal to 1, we just bail out. And otherwise, we can assure that everything's good and we can do the actual work. Now, you might be tempted to just put this in one big if condition and have something like if some parameter is not equal to 1 and some other parameter is not equal to 1. But I would personally try to avoid this, because then, well, not only does your code get longer, but also when you read this, you have to do this mental mapping and see, okay, this is not 1, but this, and then there's an and, or maybe it's an or. So if I can avoid it, just do it like this. Now there's this famous quote which gets attributed to Albert Einstein, But actually, a guy called Friedrich Schumacher said this, or he wrote it in a book. And he said, any intelligent fool can make things bigger, more complex, and more violent. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. And I want to focus on the word courage here. Simplicity takes courage. Let me give you an example. For those of you that are younger than me, this is what phones used to look like ages ago. Okay, this is a BlackBerry, so it has a lot of buttons, and they are notoriously known for having a lot of buttons, but still, this is from 2007. And every phone at that time had buttons. Maybe not as much as the BlackBerry, but still. Okay, so we have this, and at the same year, in 2007, a guy called Steve Jobs walks on the stage and has this in his hand, the iPhone. And this has, what, like 4 buttons? The home button, the power button, and the volume buttons. And it takes a lot of courage to go on the stage knowing everyone in the audience has one of these button monsters in their pocket. And I am going to show you what simplicity means. Now let me show you what this means in our Laravel community. This is code from Laravel. I think you can tell. So we have a get route, we user, and then we have some numeric parameter, and then we have an ID. This code is from 2013. It's from Laravel 3. And if you take a look at any other framework at the time that was out, the route definition was never that simple in any other framework. Same with auth checks. This is from the Laravel 3 documentation. I'm going to tweet a link from the Laravel 3 documentation. They are still online, and it's actually quite fun to read. But this still works the exact same way in Laravel 8 today. But it's not only in Laravel. We also have this in other areas of our community. This is from Pest PHP by Nuno Maduro. And well, it's basically just syntax sugar on top of PHP unit, but it's like the same thing. It takes an approach that is already out there, like PHP unit, and then makes it simpler by using a declarative approach, which helps a lot of people just get more comfortable or even start writing unit tests. And this takes courage. Same with Laravel Livewire. Caleb said, you know what, I don't want any of you to write JavaScript again, so I'm going to do this backend-based solution called Livewire. And when all these solutions were announced, they all had to face comments that said something like, well, why should I use Pest? PHP unit is there. Why should I use Livewire? It separates violation. It violates the separation of concerns. Ooh. So take courage. Know what you can skip to make things easy and simple. Not just skip something because you can then like squeeze out 2 lines of code. And be brave enough to present your code. Now this might sound funny to you, but just imagine that you are sitting in a big meeting room with a client of yours, all your colleagues, and your boss. And well, the client is asking, he says, I want to do this and that. And your colleague stands up and says, okay, I got a good solution. And he goes to the whiteboard, does, I don't know, like do bubble sorts on the whiteboard, whatever people do on whiteboards. He does all of that. And you have also a solution in your mind, which is very simple. So it takes courage to then stand up and say, well, we can actually just do it like this. And also, if you ship code, you also have to be to have courage and maybe get responses like, okay, so it took you like a day to write these 10 or 20 lines of code. That's all? I thought you were an architect. And also leave behind code that reflects you and your abilities. If you write code as if you would, for example, leave the company the next day, write it as if the code that you leave behind reflects what you stand for, what your abilities are. Now let's get back to Gary. He might wonder, now that my code is expressive and simple, can't I be replaced? Sure, yeah, that could be. But I'm telling you that if you have the skill set and the mindset of writing expressive, fun to use, easy to maintain code, your colleagues will love working with that code, so will your boss, and you will just get more work. So please don't ever write crappy code just for, you know, being invaluable for a company. Don't be Gary. So some things I want you to take away. Learn from others, read codes. Care about not only your code, but also your future self, your other employees by writing simple code and code that reflects you. Test and communicate your code. See if whatever you come up with is not only good for you or a good fit for you, but also a good fit for all of your team, the open source project that you work with, stuff like that. When I did the preparation for this talk, funny enough, a couple days earlier, Taylor retweeted this tweet, which was very fitting. And it's a quote by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who said, "In character, in manner, in style, in all things, the supreme excellence is simplicity." So I think writing simple code is not simple, but it's worth it. Thank you.
Awesome. That was great.